Some of the most important choices you make do not feel like choices at all. They feel inevitable. You meet someone and feel pulled toward them without understanding why. You trust someone immediately or distrust them just as quickly. A relationship begins and unfolds along familiar lines. Even when you promised yourself it would be different this time, these experiences feel emotional, they feel romantic, they feel personal. Carl Jung believed they are also psychological. He argued that behind many of our strongest attractions, conflicts, and projections stands an inner figure in unconscious personality that mediates our relationship to the opposite sex, to emotion, to meaning, and to the unknown. He called this figure the Anima in men and the Animus in women. These are not metaphors. They are structures of the psyche. The Anima and Animus function as inner counterparts, bridges between consciousness and the unconscious. They shape how feeling, intuition, imagination, and relationship are experienced. When unconscious, they operate autonomously. They choose for you. This is why attraction can feel compulsive, why love can feel irrational, why rejection can feel annihilating rather than disappointing. The ego believes it is responding to the outer person. Often, it is responding to an inner image. The anima and animus are formed early, long before conscious reflection is possible. They crystallize through experiences with parents, caregivers, cultural ideals, and emotional wounds. Over time, these impressions fused into a single inner figure. That figure becomes a lens. Through it, the ego perceives the opposite sex not as they are, but as the psyche expects them to be. This expectation is rarely conscious. It feels like chemistry, like fate, like recognition. Jung warned that when the anima or animus is unconscious, relationships become theaters for projection. The other person is not met as an individual, but as a carrier of an inner figure seeking expression. This creates intensity. The relationship feels meaningful immediately. The bond forms quickly. Disappointment arrives just as fast. When the projection breaks, confusion follows. You changed. You're not who I thought you were. Psychologically, something else happened. The inner figure was disturbed. The anima and animus are not passive. They are dynamic, emotional, and demanding. When they are projected outward, they bind the ego to another person in ways that feel larger than reason. This is why breakups can feel like identity collapse, why unrequited love feels humiliating rather than sad, why obsession persists even when reality contradicts it. The ego is not only losing a relationship, it is losing contact with a part of itself it had outsourced. Jung described the Anima and Animus as inner strangers because they are experienced as both intimate and alien. They speak in moods, fantasies, images, and sudden certainties. They do not argue logically. They seduce. They criticize. They inspire. They undermine. When unconscious, they appear as voices inside the psyche that feel authoritative but unexplained. A man may feel suddenly inadequate, judged, or emotionally flooded without knowing why. A woman may feel suddenly certain, rigid, or possessed by absolute opinions that feel foreign to her usual self. These are not personality flaws. They are signs of autonomous inner figures operating without conscious relationship. Jung emphasized that the Anima and Animus are not problems to be eliminated. Like the shadow, they are inevitable. The danger lies in their unconscious rule. When they remain unconscious, they distort perception. Love becomes projection. Meaning becomes dependency. Relationships become repetition. When they are recognized, something changes. The emotional charge begins to withdraw from others and return inward. Attraction becomes less compulsive. Conflict becomes more informative. The ego begins to realize that what it has been seeking outside is connected to something undeveloped within. This realization is unsettling. It dismantles romantic fantasy, it weakens certainty, it complicates desire, but it also restores agency. The anima and animus do not disappear when recognized. They transform. They stop choosing for you. They begin speaking with you. This chapter marks the beginning of that shift. Before the Anima and Animus can be understood in their forms, stages, and dangers, one truth must be established. Many of the most powerful forces shaping your relationships are not located in other people. They are active within you. And until they are recognized, they will continue to decide who you love, who you resent, and who you believe yourself to be without ever asking your permission. Understanding them does not end longing, it ends blindness. And blindness, more than heartbreak, is what keeps the same patterns repeating under different names. In the next movement of this exploration, we will examine how these inner figures form and why they so often appear disguised as destiny. The Anima and Animus do not emerge fully formed. They are constructed. Carl Jung understood these inner figures as accumulations of experienced emotional impressions layered over time, shaped long before the ego had language or reflection. They begin forming in childhood, not through deliberate teaching, but through atmosphere. The tone of early relationships matters more than their content. A parent's emotional availability, unpredictability, warmth, withdrawal, admiration, or criticism leaves traces. These traces settle into the unconscious as expectations. A child does not conclude this is how relationships work. The psyche absorbs it. What feels safe, what feels dangerous, what feels rewarding, what feels humiliating. These emotional patterns become the raw material of the Anima and Animus. Later experiences reinforce them. Cultural ideals, stories and myths, media images, peer dynamics. Together, they form an inner image that feels personal but is rarely questioned. This image does not represent a real person. It represents a psychological need. The Anima and Animus carry everything the ego has not yet integrated: emotion, imagination, intuition, vulnerability, assertiveness, meaning. Because these qualities are underdeveloped consciously, the psyche seeks them externally. This is why attraction feels magnetic. The inner image recognizes something outside that promises completion. The ego believes it has found the other. Psychologically, it has found a mirror. Jung emphasized that this process is unconscious by default. The ego experiences attraction as self-evident. It does not ask why this person, in this way, at this time. The question feels unnecessary. The Anima or Animus has already decided. This decision is not rational. It is symbolic. The person who triggers attraction embodies traits associated with the inner image. They may not actually possess these traits consistently, but the psyche perceives them through projection. Reality bends. Flaws are minimized. Signals are ignored. Contradictions are rationalized. The inner figure protects itself. This protection is not malicious. It is preservative. The psyche does not want to lose access to what feels essential. When reality eventually intrudes and it always does, the disappointment feels disproportionate. The ego reacts as though something vital has been taken away, because it has. What was taken was not the person, but the illusion of completion. Jung believed that repeated relational patterns are not evidence of bad luck, but of an unconscious inner image seeking expression. The psyche recreates familiar dynamics until awareness intervenes. This is why people often say, "I always end up with the same kind of person." They do. The Anima or Animus selects them. The ego believes it is choosing freely. In reality, it is being guided by an unexamined structure. This guidance extends beyond romance. It shapes friendships. It shapes authority relationships. It shapes spiritual longing. Wherever meaning feels outsourced, the Anima or Animus is active. Jung warned that the most dangerous aspect of these inner figures is not their emotional intensity, but their conviction. They speak with certainty. They feel right. They do not tolerate doubt. This certainty feels reassuring. It is also blinding. The ego mistakes emotional force for truth. It confuses intensity with destiny. The formation of the anima and animus explains why insight alone rarely changes relationship patterns. The image is emotional, not conceptual. It must be experienced consciously to loosen its grip. Awareness does not dissolve the image immediately. It introduces friction. Friction slows compulsion. Friction creates space. Space allows reflection. The ego begins to notice attraction rather than surrender to it. It can ask, "What am I seeing here?" rather than "Why does this feel inevitable?" This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Jung believed that the anima and animus mature as consciousness develops. When ignored, they remain primitive childlike, demanding, absolutists. When related to consciously, they evolve. They become guides rather than rulers. But before this evolution can occur, the ego must recognize a difficult truth. The people who attract you most powerfully are not random. They are meaningful. Not because they complete you, but because they reveal what is missing from conscious life. Until that revelation is accepted, the psyche will continue to seek completion externally, again and again, through new faces, new stories, new disappointments. The inner image does not stop searching until it is recognized. And recognition begins not with analysis, but with attention. Attention to patterns, attention to intensity, attention to the emotional certainty that precedes choice. In the next movement, we will explore how the Anima and Animus express themselves when they remain unconscious, and why their influence can feel both intoxicating and destructive. That influence is not accidental. It is the psyche insisting on balance even when the ego resists it. When the anima or animus remains unconscious, it does not stay quiet. It projects. Carl Jung believed that projection is the primary way these inner figures express themselves. The psyche locates the inner image in another person and treats that person as though they embody something essential. This is not metaphorical. The experience feels absolute. You feel seen, you feel understood, you feel complete. The person appears to carry meaning, depth, and promise far beyond what the actual relationship can sustain. Reality becomes secondary to feeling. This is the illusion of completion. The ego believes it has found what it lacks. Desire becomes focused, intense, and uncompromising. Doubt fades. Caution feels unnecessary. Obsession often follows. Not obsession in the dramatic sense, but psychological fixation. The mind returns to the person repeatedly. Fantasies form effortlessly. The future is imagined in detail before the present has even unfolded. The anima or animus feeds this process. It does not want to be questioned. It does not want to be withdrawn. It wants expression. When the projection is strong, the other person is no longer encountered as they are. They become a screen onto which the psyche casts its unlived inner life. Their words feel symbolic. Their actions feel meaningful. Their absence feels intolerable. Jung warned that this intensity is not evidence of love. It is evidence of possession. Possession here does not mean pathology. It means the ego is being influenced by an autonomous inner figure that has not yet been recognized as internal. This is why reasoning rarely helps. Friends point out inconsistencies. Red flags are explained away. Reality is bent to protect the image. The psyche resists anything that threatens access to the projected figure. Losing the projection feels like losing meaning itself. When the projection eventually collapses as it must, the result is often confusion, anger, or despair. They betrayed me. They changed. I don't recognize them anymore. What has changed is not the person. What has changed is the projection. Jung described this moment as psychologically dangerous because the energy invested in the inner image has nowhere to go. If the ego cannot reclaim it consciously, it turns inward as depression or outward as blame. This is why breakups can feel annihilating rather than painful. The psyche is not only losing a relationship, it is losing contact with an inner source of vitality. Until that source is reclaimed, The cycle repeats. Another person appears. Another projection forms. Another illusion of completion takes hold. The Anima and Animus do not care about the individual you project onto. They care about expression. This is why the pattern persists across different people. Different face, same role. Jung believed that the withdrawal of projection is one of the most difficult psychological tasks because it demands responsibility for longing itself. Longing must be owned. When the ego begins to recognize that what it seeks in another belongs to the psyche, attraction loses some of its compulsive force. Desire remains, but it becomes less absolute. The person becomes human again. This humanization can feel disappointing at first. The intensity fades. The fantasy dissolves. The ego mourns what it thought it had found, but something else emerges. Freedom. The anima or animus no longer dictates from the shadows. It becomes available for dialogue. Its energy can be redirected inward into creativity, reflection, emotional depth, and meaning. Jung believed that genuine love becomes possible only after projection weakens. Love requires seeing the other as they are, not as a carrier of inner necessity. Before that, the relationship serves the psyche more than the person. This does not mean relationships formed through projection are meaningless. They are meaningful precisely because they reveal what the ego lacks, but they are not sustainable until that lack is addressed consciously. The illusion of completion fades, not because it was false, but because completion was never meant to be found externally. The anima and animus do not exist to be fulfilled by others. They exist to be integrated. Until that integration begins, obsession feels inevitable. Once it begins, obsession loses its authority, desire becomes choice, attraction becomes information, relationship becomes encounter rather than compulsion. This shift does not eliminate longing. It places it in the right location. And when longing belongs to the psyche rather than to fantasy, it becomes a guide rather than a tyrant. The next movement of this exploration will examine how the anima and animus express themselves in distorted forms and why, when ignored, they often become inner critics or tyrants rather than guides. These distortions are not failures, they are warnings. Warnings that the psyche is asking gang for conscious relationship. When the anima or animus is ignored, it does not remain neutral. It distorts. Carl Jung observed that unconscious inner figures tend to polarize. Instead of functioning as bridges to the unconscious, they become either seducers or tyrants pulling the ego toward illusion or crushing it with judgment. Both forms are dangerous. The seducer appears first. It promises intensity, meaning, and escape from ordinariness. It whispers that fulfillment lies just beyond reach if only the right person, experience, or recognition can be found. This voice feels intimate. It romanticizes suffering. It exaggerates longing. It glorifies the unattainable. Under its influence, the ego becomes restless. Contentment feels like stagnation. Ordinary life feels empty. Desire escalates without resolution. The seducer does not want fulfillment. It wants pursuit. When fulfillment approaches, interest fades. A new object appears. The psyche remains perpetually dissatisfied, chasing an ideal that cannot be embodied. Jung warned that this dynamic often masquerades as passion, creativity, or spirituality. In reality, it is avoidance of inner development. The energy that should be integrated inwardly is endlessly displaced outward. The tyrant appears later, when projection fails repeatedly, when seduction no longer convinces. The anima or animus turns critical. It attacks the ego for its failures, inadequacies, and compromises. This voice is harsh. You are weak. You are unworthy. You will never be enough. The ego experiences this criticism as truth rather than opinion. It feels authoritative because it arises from within. No external validation can silence it. The tyrant drains vitality, confidence erodes, initiative collapses, joy becomes suspect, The ego begins to live cautiously, trying to appease an inner standard that constantly shifts. Nothing feels sufficient. Jung believed that depression often emerges here not as chemical imbalance alone, but as a psychic condition where inner authority has become tyrannical. The seducer and the tyrant are two faces of the same problem, an inner figure demanding recognition. When ignored, it manipulates. When resisted, it attacks. The anima or animus wants dialogue, not obedience. Dialogue requires differentiation. The ego must learn to say, "This voice is not the whole of me." It must recognize the inner figure as a part, not an absolute authority. This recognition weakens possession. The ego can listen without submitting. It can consider without obeying. It can feel longing without chasing illusion. It can hear criticism without collapsing. This differentiation is difficult because the inner figure speaks emotionally, not rationally. It bypasses argument. It influences mood, energy, and perception directly. Jung emphasized that engaging the anima or animus consciously often begins with naming. Naming creates distance. Distance restores perspective. This longing is not destiny. This criticism is not truth. These statements are not denials. They are boundaries. Boundaries protect the ego while allowing communication. When the seducer is recognized, desire becomes informative rather than compulsive. It reveals what is missing without demanding immediate satisfaction. When the tyrant is recognized, criticism becomes signal rather than sentence. It points toward imbalance without annihilating worth. Neither transformation happens quickly. The anima and animus are emotionally charged because they carry life energy. Redirecting that energy inward requires patience and tolerance for frustration. The ego must learn to withstand longing without chasing and criticism without submission. This is maturation. Jung believed that when the anima or animus is related to consciously, it transforms into a guide. It no longer seduces or tyrannizes. It informs, inspires, and challenges without dominating. The guide does not promise completion. It does not threaten collapse. It offers orientation toward meaning that is not borrowed, toward creativity that is not compulsive, toward relationship that is not possessed. Until this transformation occurs, the psyche oscillates between craving and self-rejection. The seducer inflates, the tyrant deflates. Both exhaust the ego. Integration stabilizes this oscillation. It allows desire to coexist with restraint. It allows standards to exist without cruelty. The anima and animus stop demanding perfection or fantasy. They begin participating, and participation rather than domination is what allows psychological life to deepen without becoming unlivable. In the next movement, we will explore the stages through which the anima and animus evolve when consciously engaged, and why this evolution is essential for individuation rather than just relationship satisfaction. The inner stranger does not disappear, it matures. And maturity is what transforms compulsion into dialogue. The anima and animus do not remain fixed. They evolve but only when consciousness engages them. Carl Jung described these inner figures as developing through recognizable stages. When left unconscious, they remain primitive and disruptive. When related to consciously, they mature into sources of meaning rather than compulsion. These stages are not rigid categories. They are patterns. Early stages are dominated by projection. Later stages involve integration. At the most primitive level, the anima or animus is purely instinctual. It is associated with raw attraction, sexuality, and emotional intensity. Desire dominates. The ego feels pulled toward pleasure, excitement, or validation without reflection. This stage is powerful but unstable. Relationships formed here burn brightly and collapse quickly. They are fueled by fantasy rather than understanding. When the image breaks, disappointment feels catastrophic. As consciousness develops, the anima or animus takes on a romantic form. The inner figure becomes idealized. It carries beauty, inspiration, and promise. The ego experiences longing not just for pleasure, but for meaning. This stage often feels poetic. Art, music, spirituality, and love intertwine. The inner image inspires creativity and devotion, yet it remains externalized. Meaning is still sought in another person or ideal. The danger here is inflation. The ego confuses inspiration with fulfillment. It believes that proximity to the image equals growth. When reality intrudes, disillusionment follows. The next stage introduces differentiation. The ego begins to recognize that the image does not belong entirely to the other. Projection weakens. Disappointment becomes instructive rather than annihilating. The inner figure begins to separate from its external carriers. This stage is uncomfortable. The world loses some of its magic. Relationships feel less intense. The ego may feel empty or directionless for a time. This emptiness is not regression. It is withdrawal of projection. Jung believed that many people retreat here, prefer an illusion to integration. They chase intensity rather than tolerate the silence that follows disillusionment. Those who endured this stage reach a deeper transformation. The anima or animus becomes inner. It begins to function as a mediator to the unconscious rather than a dictator of desire. Intuition sharpens. Emotional insight deepens. Meaning arises from within rather than being borrowed. This is the stage where creativity stabilizes. The ego no longer needs external validation to feel alive. Relationships become encounters rather than mirrors. Attraction remains, but it no longer overwhelms judgment. At its most mature form, the anima or animus becomes a psychological guide. It supports reflection rather than fantasy. It challenges without humiliating. It inspires without seducing. It connects the ego to deeper layers of the psyche without possession. Jung emphasized that this maturity is rare because it demands sustained self-reflection and tolerance for loss of illusion. Illusion is comfortable. Integration is demanding. The stages do not unfold automatically with age. They unfold with awareness. A person can remain trapped in primitive projection throughout life if the inner image is never questioned. Another can mature early through painful but conscious encounters with disappointment. Progress is not linear. Regression occurs under stress. Old projections return. Intensity resurfaces. This does not mean failure. It means the psyche is alive. The task is not to eliminate projection forever, but to recognize it when it appears. Recognition shortens its duration and limits its power. Jung believed that the development of the anima and animus is essential for individuation. Without it, the ego remains dependent on external sources for meaning. With it, meaning becomes internally anchored. This anchoring changes everything. Love becomes choice rather than compulsion. Creativity becomes expression rather than escape. Spirituality becomes grounded rather than inflated. The anima and animus do not vanish at maturity. They participate. They bring imagination, feeling, and insight into conscious life without overwhelming it. They enrich rather than dominate. This enrichment does not make life easier. It makes it deeper. Depth replaces intensity. Stability replaces obsession. Dialogue replaces possession. The stages of development are not milestones to be achieved. They are movements to be revisited. Each new phase of life reactivates the inner image. New challenges demand new forms of integration. What was once mature can become primitive again under unfamiliar conditions. This is not regression, it is renewal. The psyche demands balance repeatedly, not once. In the next movement, we will explore how anima and animus integration reshapes relationships, not by removing longing, but by transforming how longing is lived. That transformation is subtle, but it is what allows connection without loss of self. When the anima or animus begins to integrate, relationships change in ways that are often confusing at first, not because something is lost, but because something withdraws. Carl Jung observed that as projection weakens, emotional intensity often decreases. What once felt electric now feels quieter. What once felt inevitable now feels optional. Many people misinterpret this shift. They believe love has faded. They believe passion has died. They believe something essential is missing. Psychologically, something has returned home. The energy that once animated the other person is reclaimed by the psyche. The ego no longer relies on another to carry meaning, vitality, or direction. This redistribution can feel like loss because projection once provided emotional amplification, but amplification is not intimacy. Intimacy begins when the other is no longer required to complete you. When projection diminishes, disappointment becomes tolerable. Conflict becomes specific rather than catastrophic. Differences are experienced as differences, not betrayals. The other person becomes real. Real people are less intoxicating than projections. They are also more reliable. Jung believed that genuine relationship begins only after projection is withdrawn. Before that, the relationship serves the psyche's need for completion rather than mutual encounter. This does not mean that relationships formed through projection are false. They are developmental. They reveal inner imbalance. They initiate growth. They expose what the ego has not yet integrated. Once integration begins, relationships shift from destiny-driven to choice-based. Choice feels less dramatic. It is quieter. It is steadier. It is less addictive. Many people unconsciously resist this transition. They equate intensity with love and calm with stagnation. They chase the emotional highs of projection rather than tolerate the groundedness of integration. Jung saw this as a misunderstanding of maturity. Maturity does not eliminate desire. It relocates it. Desire becomes dialogical rather than compulsive. Attraction still exists, but it no longer overrides discernment. Longing remains, but it no longer demands possession. This allows a new form of closeness. Closeness without fusion, connection without loss of self, care without idealization. When anima or animus energy is integrated, the ego becomes less defensive. It no longer needs the other to mirror its worth or confirm its identity. Boundaries become clearer without becoming rigid. This clarity reduces conflict. Arguments are no longer charged with existential threat. Disagreement does not feel like abandonment. Separation does not feel like annihilation. The relationship gains resilience. Jung emphasized that integration does not guarantee relational success. It does not make people compatible or remove hardship. It changes how hardship is experienced. Pain becomes navigable. Loss becomes survivable. Difference becomes workable. This shift also alters attraction patterns. The ego becomes less drawn to those who carry exaggerated projections. Overly dramatic, unavailable, or idealized figures lose some of their magnetism. Attraction aligns more closely with reality. This can feel disorienting. People may say, "I don't know what I want anymore." This uncertainty is not confusion. It is freedom. Freedom from unconscious repetition. With freedom comes responsibility. The ego can no longer blame fate, chemistry, or destiny for its choices. It must choose deliberately. Deliberate choice lacks romance. It gains depth. Jung believed that depth, not intensity, sustains relationships over time. Depth allows change without collapse. It tolerates disappointment without withdrawal. When the anima or animus is integrated, the relationship is no longer a solution to inner conflict. It becomes a meeting between two incomplete beings who are not asking the other to finish what they refuse to develop themselves. This meeting is humbling. It dismantles fantasy. It weakens certainty. It demands honesty, but it also allows love to emerge without illusion. Love that sees rather than projects. Love that chooses rather than compulsively attaches. Love that remains present even when desire fluctuates. This form of love is less dramatic. It is also more real. In the next movement, We will examine how Anima and Animus integration reshapes creativity, spirituality, and meaning, revealing why these inner figures are not limited to relationships, but influence the entire orientation of a life. Their integration does not narrow experience. It expands it without requiring anyone else to carry the weight of your inner life. The Anima and Animus do not influence relationships alone. They shape how meaning itself is experienced. Carl Jung believed that these inner figures act as mediators to the unconscious. When they are projected outward, meaning is sought in people, ideals, or beliefs. When they are integrated, meaning begins to arise from within. This shift has profound consequences. Creativity often changes first. When the anima or animus is unconscious, creativity tends to be episodic and compulsive. Inspiration arrives suddenly and disappears just as quickly. The ego feels dependent on mood, fascination, or external stimulation to feel alive. Art becomes escape. Work becomes obsession. Spirituality becomes inflation. The inner figure demands expression but offers no structure. Integration alters this pattern. Creative energy becomes steadier. It no longer needs dramatic highs to function. Expression feels less urgent but more sustainable. The ego can work without waiting for inspiration because inspiration is no longer externalized. Jung saw this as a maturation of imagination. Imagination shifts from fantasy to symbolic reflection. Images are no longer taken literally. They are explored, interpreted, and related to consciously. This allows creativity to deepen. Art becomes inquiry rather than compensation. Writing becomes dialogue rather than confession. Music becomes exploration rather than release. The same applies to spirituality. When the anima or animus is projected, spiritual longing often seeks external authority. The ego becomes fascinated with teachers, doctrines, rituals, or experiences that promise transcendence. This fascination can feel transformative. It can also become inflated. The ego confuses symbolic experience with literal truth. Insight becomes identity. Experience becomes status. Spirituality becomes another persona. Jung warned that this is not integration. It is substitution. The inner figure has simply found a new object. When integration begins, spirituality changes tone. It becomes quieter, less spectacular, more grounded. Meaning no longer depends on peak experiences. It emerges through reflection, responsibility, and attention to inner life. Symbols are held rather than worshipped. Mystery is tolerated rather than explained away. This tolerance is essential. The anima and animus connect the ego to mystery. When unconscious, they dramatize it. When integrated, they mediate it. Meditation becomes encounter rather than escape. Ritual becomes orientation rather than guarantee. Faith becomes humility rather than certainty. Jung believed that modern people often suffer not from lack of meaning, but from misplaced meaning. Meaning is projected outward and then collapses when its carriers fail. The anima and animus are central to this collapse. They hold the psyche's capacity for depth. When they are denied or misdirected, life feels empty. When they are related to consciously, meaning reorganizes itself internally. This does not produce answers. It produces orientation. Orientation allows life to be lived without constant explanation. It provides a sense of direction that does not require constant validation. This is why integration often leads to simplification, fewer compulsions, fewer obsessions, less urgency. Life becomes less dramatic. It becomes more intentional. Jung believed that this intentionality is the foundation of individuation. Without it, the ego remains reactive, driven by inner figures it does not recognize. With it, the ego participates in shaping its own meaning. The anima and animus do not disappear in this process. They become collaborators. They contribute imagination, intuition, and emotional depth without overwhelming consciousness. They enrich life without demanding possession. This enrichment does not make life easier. It makes it inhabitable. Creativity becomes sustainable. Spirituality becomes grounded. Meaning becomes lived rather than chased. The psyche no longer needs to escape itself. It begins to listen. In the next movement, we will examine the dangers of partial integration and why recognizing the anima or animus intellectually without emotional engagement can create new forms of imbalance. Integration is not insight alone. It is relationship. And relationship requires continued attention, patience, and humility. Without these, the inner stranger simply finds new disguises. With them, it becomes a guide that points inward rather than away. That guidance is subtle, but it is what allows a life to deepen without becoming fragmented or inflated. Recognition alone is not integration. This distinction is crucial. Carl Jung warned that becoming aware of the anima or animus without forming a genuine relationship with it often creates a new kind of imbalance. The ego gains language, concepts, and confidence, but not transformation. This is partial integration. It is subtle, it is convincing, and it is dangerous. When the ego can name the anima or animus intellectually, it may believe it has mastered them. Projection seems to weaken. Obsession appears reduced. Insight creates a sense of superiority, but emotionally, little has changed. The inner figure has not been related to it, has been appropriated. The ego uses psychological knowledge as armor. It explains away intensity instead of engaging it. It analyzes desire rather than listening to it. It interprets symbols without allowing them to disturb certainty. This produces dryness. Life feels flatter, but not deeper. Intensity disappears, but so does vitality. Control increases, but meaning recedes. Jung believed this state is often mistaken for maturity. It is not. It is defensive adaptation. The anima or animus responds to this appropriation by withdrawing energy or re-emerging in distorted forms. Creativity declines. Relationships feel empty. Spiritual curiosity fades or becomes cynical. The ego wonders why understanding did not lead to fulfillment. Because understanding replaced relationship. The anima and animus are not ideas to be solved. They are inner presences. They demand engagement, not explanation. Another form of partial integration occurs when the ego identifies with the inner figure instead of relating to it. A man may become emotionally flooded, moody, or passive, believing he is honoring his anima. A woman may become rigid, opinionated, or ideologically possessed, believing she is integrating her animus. In both cases, the ego has collapsed into the inner figure rather than differentiated from it. This is not integration. It is possession in reverse. Jung emphasized that integration requires tension, not fusion. The ego must remain distinct while allowing influence. Without distinction, consciousness dissolves into impulse or certainty. Partial integration feels attractive because it offers relief without effort. No longing to tolerate, no ambiguity to hold, no conflict to endure, but it exacts a cost. The psyche loses depth. Life becomes explainable but uninhabited. Jung believed that true integration always preserves mystery. The anima and animus never become fully transparent. They remain partly unknown because they connect the ego to layers of the psyche that cannot be exhausted by understanding. When the ego insists on clarity, the psyche retaliates with emptiness or chaos. Integration requires humility. Humility accepts that not everything can be controlled, named, or resolved. It allows longing to exist without immediate satisfaction. It tolerates uncertainty without collapsing into explanation. This humility keeps the relationship alive. The ego listens. The inner figure responds. Dialogue continues. Partial integration ends dialogue. It replaces listening with certainty. This is why some people become dogmatic about psychology or spirituality. Concepts become identities. Language replaces experience. Insight replaces encounter. The anima or animus is silence, not integrated. And silence is not peace, it is withdrawal. Jung believed that when inner figures withdraw, the psyche loses orientation, meaning dissipates, motivation weakens, life feels technically functional, but emotionally hollow. This hollowness often leads people back to projection. Another person, another cause, another belief. The cycle resumes. True integration resists this cycle. It does not aim to finish the work. It aims to continue it consciously. The ego accepts that relationship with the anima or animus is ongoing. It changes with age, circumstance, and psychological development. What was once seductive becomes instructive. What was once tyrannical becomes challenging. What was once projected becomes internal. This evolution cannot be rushed. It requires patience, attention, and tolerance for discomfort. Jung believed that the greatest danger in inner work is not darkness, but premature certainty. Certainty closes the psyche, relationship opens it. The anima and animus do not ask to be solved. They ask to be related to. When that request is honored, depth returns. Creativity stabilizes. Relationships regain vitality. Meaning reorganizes itself from within rather than being borrowed. Partial integration offers relief. Full integration offers life, not ease, not answers, but participation, and participation rather than masteries. What allows the psyche to remain alive without being torn apart by its own inner forces. In the next movement, we will examine how anima and animus integration supports individuation itself, why without it, the journey toward wholeness remains incomplete. No matter how much insight is gained, individuation does not happen in isolation. It requires relationship not only with the world, but with what is other within. Carl Jung understood the anima and animus as central figures in this process. Without conscious relationship to them, individuation remains partial. No matter how developed the ego appears, this is because individuation is not the strengthening of identity. It is the relativization of it. The ego must discover that it is not the whole of the psyche. It is a center of awareness within a larger field. The anima and animus represent that larger field in personal form. They introduce alterity. Alterity destabilizes ego certainty. When the ego encounters the anima or animus consciously, it encounters something that does not think, feel, or value in the same way it does. This encounter is unsettling because it disrupts the illusion of self-sufficiency, but it is also essential. Without alterity, the ego becomes closed. It repeats itself. It mistakes coherence for wholeness. Individuation requires openness to what the ego is not. The anima and animus carry precisely this difference. They challenge habitual attitudes. They question fixed values. They expose blind spots. When ignored, this challenge is projected outward and experienced as fate, attraction, or conflict. When integrated, it becomes inner dialogue. Dialogue is the engine of individuation. Not agreement, not harmony, but conversation. Jung believed that the psyche grows through sustained engagement with inner opposites. The anima and animus embody one of the most significant of these opposites because they personify what consciousness lacks. They are not additions to the ego, they are corrections. These corrections are rarely gentle. They arrive as mood shifts, doubts, inspirations, and disturbances. They interrupt certainty, they question direction, they introduce values that feel alien at first. This is why individuation often feels like disorientation rather than progress. The ego loses its monopoly. It must negotiate. Negotiation requires humility. The ego learns that its perspective is limited. It must listen to another voice that cannot be silenced without consequence. This listening does not mean obedience. It means consideration. When the anima or animus is engaged consciously, decisions change. The ego becomes less rigid, more reflective, more nuanced. Choices are no longer made solely on the basis of control, approval, or adaptation. They begin to include meaning, authenticity, and inner coherence. This inclusion slows life down, but it deepens it. Jung emphasized that individuation is not about becoming special. It is about becoming real. Reality includes contradiction. The Anima and Animus ensure that contradiction remains present. They prevent the ego from collapsing into one-sidedness. They resist final answers. This resistance frustrates the ego. It wants resolution. It wants clarity. It wants certainty. The inner figures offer none of these permanently. They offer orientation instead. Orientation allows movement without guarantee. It provides direction without map. It demands trust and process rather than outcome. This is why individuation cannot be reduced to technique. It is lived. The Anima and Animus support this living by mediating between conscious intention and unconscious necessity. They translate what the psyche requires into images, moods, and intuitions. When ignored, these translations appear as symptoms. When heard, they appear as guidance. The difference lies not in the content, but in the relationship. Individuation depends on this relationship because without it, the ego mistakes adaptation for wholeness. It becomes efficient, functional, and socially successful while remaining internally divided. Jung warned that such individuals often feel an unnamed emptiness. They have achieved identity without meaning. Meaning cannot be engineered. It emerges from dialogue with what resists. The ego, the Anima and Animus, resists by design. They carry the psyche's demand for balance, depth, and transformation. They disrupt the ego's plans when those plans become too narrow. This disruption is not sabotage. It is correction. Correction feels hostile when the ego clings to certainty. It feels supportive when the ego accepts limitation. Individuation requires the latter. It asks the ego to step out of the center and allow other perspectives to inform life. It does not destroy identity. The Anima and Animus are essential to this relativization because they introduce inner otherness in a form the ego can relate to. Without them, individuation remains abstract. With them, it becomes personal, and it is only when individuation becomes personal felt, lived, negotiated, that it moves beyond concept and becomes transformation. In the next movement, we will examine what happens when the Anima and Animus are not integrated at all and why their absence from conscious life often leads not to peace, but to compulsion, rigidity, and repetition. The inner other will be heard. The only question is how. The Anima and Animus do not disappear when ignored. They reassert themselves. Carl Jung observed that when inner figures are excluded from conscious life, they do not become silent. They become symptomatic. What is not related to internally is acted out externally or experienced as fate. This is not punishment. It is compensation. The psyche compensates for one-sided consciousness by forcing an encounter. When the Anima or Animus is ignored, relationships grow repetitive. The same emotional conflicts reappear in different forms. Attraction becomes compulsive rather than chosen. Disappointment feels familiar rather than surprising. People often describe this as bad luck. Psychologically, it is pattern. The inner other has not been given space to speak inwardly, so it speaks through events. Jung believed that ignoring the Anima or Animus often leads to rigidity. The ego hardens around identity, values, and beliefs that feel stable but lack vitality. Life becomes predictable. Order increases. Meaning fades. This rigidity feels safe. It is also lifeless. Without inner dialogue, the ego loses access to imagination, intuition, and emotional nuance. Decisions become purely rational or purely moral. Complexity is flattened. Ambivalence is rejected. The psyche resists this flattening. It introduces disturbance. Disturbance can take many forms. Sudden infatuation that disrupts stability, unexpected emotional outbursts, midlife crises marked by impulsive change, obsessive interests that feel alien to one's established self. These disruptions are not random. They represent the psyche reclaiming neglected territory. Jung warned that the longer the inner figures are ignored, the more forcefully they return. Early neglect produces longing. Prolonged neglect produces eruption. This is why people sometimes act out of character later in life. The character was incomplete. The anime or animus was excluded to preserve adaptation. When adaptation is no longer enough, the excluded part demands recognition. Ignoring the inner other also affects ethical life. Without dialogue, the ego becomes self-referential. It believes its values are complete and its perspective sufficient. Moral certainty increases. Empathy diminishes. The anima and animus introduce otherness. Without them, the ego loses the ability to imagine perspectives beyond its own. It becomes convinced rather than reflective. Jung believed this state is psychologically dangerous not because it produces immediate harm, but because it erodes self-correction. The ego no longer hears internal dissent. When dissent disappears internally, it appears externally. Conflict intensifies, enemies multiply, projection increases. The psyche seeks balance by relocating inner difference outward. This relocation fuels polarization at the individual level. Ignoring the inner other leads to a sense of inner dryness. Life functions, but something essential is missing. People describe this as emptiness, boredom, or quiet despair. They may not know what is wrong. Nothing is obviously broken. What is missing is relationship with the inner figures that carry feeling, imagination, and meaning. Jung believed that many modern symptoms burn out cynicism. Compulsive distractionary expressions of this missing relationship. The psyche is starved of dialogue. When dialogue is absent, the psyche substitutes stimulation. Stimulation is not meaning. It detracts without nourishing. The anima and animus do not demand dramatic attention. They demand presence. They want to be considered, not indulged or suppressed. When this consideration is denied, the psyche escalates. It creates symptoms loud enough to interrupt life. Jung did not interpret symptoms as failures. He saw them as messages. Messages that consciousness has become too narrow. Ignoring the inner other narrows life. It reduces possibility. It limits creativity. It confines meaning to function. The anima and animus exist to prevent this confinement. They insist that life be more than efficient. They insist on depth. When they are ignored, depth does not vanish. It returns as disturbance. This disturbance can be destructive if misunderstood. It can also be transformative if listened to. The difference lies in the ego's response. If the ego reacts defensively, the disturbance intensifies. If the ego responds reflexively, dialogue begins. Dialogue restores balance. The anima and animus do not want to overthrow the ego. They want to relate to it. When that relationship is refused, they become adversaries. When it is accepted, they become allies. Jung believed that psychological health does not mean absence of conflict. It means capacity for conversation. Conversation between conscious intention and unconscious necessity. The inner other ensures that this conversation continues. Ignoring it does not end the dialogue. It only forces it into forms the ego cannot control. In the final movement of this exploration, we will examine how conscious relationship with the anima and animus transforms not only inner life, but one's orientation toward the future revealing, why individuation without the inner other is incomplete. No matter how coherent the ego appears, the anima and animus are not meant to replace the ego. They are meant to complete its perspective. Carl Jung was clear that individuation does not dissolve identity. It deepens it. The ego remains necessary. It organizes life, makes decisions, and holds responsibility. What changes is its relationship to what lies beyond it. Wholeness does not mean fusion. It means relationship without collapse. When the anima or animus is integrated, the ego no longer feels threatened by inner difference. It does not need to dominate or suppress what feels unfamiliar. It can listen without surrendering control. This balance is delicate. Too much identification with the inner figure leads to inflation, moodiness, or loss of direction. Too much resistance leads to rigidity, emptiness, and repetition. Integration lives between these extremes. The ego remains centered, but no longer isolated. This changes how the future is approached. Life is no longer driven solely by adaptation or compensation. Decisions are informed not just by logic or morality, but by inner resonance. Choices feel aligned rather than reactive. This alignment is not certainty. It is coherence. Jung believed that coherence emerges when conscious values are in dialogue with unconscious necessity. The anima and animus carry that necessity. They signal when life has become too narrow, too rigid, or too borrowed. Listening to them does not guarantee comfort. It guarantees relevance. Relevance means that what you pursue corresponds to who you are becoming, not just who you have been. It allows life to evolve without rupture. When the inner figures are integrated, longing changes. Longing no longer seeks rescue. Desire no longer demands possession. Meaning no longer requires external validation. The psyche becomes less dependent on intensity to feel alive. It can tolerate quiet periods without panic. It can endure uncertainty without collapsing into fantasy. This tolerance is maturity. It does not eliminate passion. It grounds it. The anima and animus continue to influence life, but they do so as partners rather than rulers. They contribute imagination, feeling, and insight without overwhelming judgment. The ego becomes less defensive. It no longer needs to prove itself constantly. It can admit uncertainty without humiliation. It can change without feeling erased. This flexibility is essential for wholeness. Rigid identities fracture under pressure. Flexible identities adapt without losing integrity. Jung believed that psychological health is measured not by happiness, but by capacity to hold tension, to tolerate contradiction, to remain conscious when life refuses simplicity. The anima and animus expand this capacity. They introduce depth where there was surface. They introduce dialogue where there was certainty. They introduce meaning where there was function. This meaning is not dramatic. It is lived. It shows up in choices that feel internally consistent even when they are difficult. It shows up in relationships that allow difference without threats. It shows up in creativity that expresses inner life rather than escaping it. Wholeness does not make life easier. It makes it inhabitable. The ego no longer has to fight itself constantly. It no longer has to chase completion externally. It no longer has to silence inner voices to function. Instead, it listens. Listening does not mean obeying. It means acknowledging that life is larger than conscious intention. The anima and animus represent that largeness in personal form. When they are recognized and related to, the psyche gains depth without losing structure. The ego gains perspective without losing agency. This is the balance Jung sought, not enlightenment, not purity, not transcendence, but participation in one's own psychological life. Participation requires effort. It requires humility. It requires patience. It requires willingness to remain incomplete. Incompleteness is not failure. It is condition. The anima and animus remind the ego of this condition again and again. They prevent premature closure. They keep life open. When that openness is accepted, the psyche does not fragment. It unfolds. Becoming whole does not mean becoming someone else. It means becoming able to live with everything you are, without denying it, without acting it out blindly, and without losing yourself in the process. That is not resolution. It is orientation. And orientation, not answers, is what allows a life to move forward without betraying its depth. The inner other does not disappear at the end of this work. It remains, but now it walks beside you, not ahead of you, not behind you, and no longer in secret. That companionship is what makes wholeness possible without the loss of self.